This is an RTX 4090. This is an RTX 4080. And well, this is adorable. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son, it is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So not everyone has huge amounts of money in this day and age to spend on a PC, let alone a graphics card. But even though it may not seem like it, GPUs are developing and offering more performance than ever before. And with the launch of the RTX 4070 today at $599, could this be the most popular RTX 40 series that NVIDIA release? Now, I don't want to stomp over old ground when it comes to other cards in the 40 series stack that maybe don't offer too much, let's say, value for money, because I want to give the RTX 4070 a fair shake, especially considering the large uptake it has over its predecessors, the RTX 3070 and 3070 Ti. Not only do we now get 50% more GDDR6X memory, but we now see a huge uptake in L2 cache, up from 4MB to a whopping 32MB, to keep it aligned with the rest of the Ada Lovelace family. Which, along with the AD104 based GPU, means we now get the latest generation of both RT cores and Tensor cores, along with NVIDIA's latest DLSS 3 upscaling technology, as you'd expect. What is interesting, however, is how NVIDIA have managed to harness power that is said to offer the same performance as an RTX 3080, 10GB, all while using less than 200 watts. A somewhat stark difference from the 320 watts that the 30 series card maxed out at. Couple this with the latest DLSS 3 technology with frame generation, which NVIDIA are claiming can give 1.4 times more performance than a 3080, then on paper, it seems NVIDIA really could be onto a winner. More performance, all while using significantly less power and coming in $100 cheaper at launch too. Also factor in that a lot of gamers skipped a generation and are still clinging on to their trusty RTX 2080s, which again, NVIDIA claims some pretty big uplifts, with 1.6 times more performance in favour of the RTX 4070 and 2.2 times more performance again while utilising DLSS 3 with frame generation. Now, anyone who knows me or has seen my content before will know that I generally take brands' own findings with a pinch of salt. I mean, it's what keeps us in business, doing unbiased benchmark content to see if brands can be held to account and actually offer up something that is worth buying, because I'm all about value for money. And that's what's slightly interesting about this launch. Today sees the launch of the oh so cute Founders Edition along with MSRP based cards, while tomorrow is for the more expensive custom AIB cards that don't hit MSRP. So definitely keep an eye out for that one. Now, let's talk about the cards, because we have two MSRP based cards here today, starting with the 4070 FE that frankly shocked us in the office. The sheer size of it was, well, somewhat laughable, followed by a cute kind of reaction. It kept the design of the 4080 and 4090 but just shrunk it down, making it much more appealing to gamers out there who now no longer have to worry about whether it will fit in their case or not. The design, as a typical Founders, is simply stunning, and I've made my feelings pretty clear on that kind of when we looked at other Founders models in the stack, the 4080 and the 4090. Coupled with the fact that it is the cheapest model in each range, it really makes it kind of more difficult than ever for AIB partners to upsell their own products. Now, if you've seen a 40 series Founders card before, there's nothing new here, other than the sheer size of it being so small in comparison to the 4080 and 4090. Now coming in at 242mm long, 110mm high and 40mm wide, meaning it will only take up 2 expansion slots in your case. Now for me, the smaller design is a great move and is likely due to the lower power constraints that NVIDIA were able to kind of cut things down on so dramatically. And as long as the performance is there, it should actually pay off. Now, due to its kind of sheer size or lack of it, it also means that it only weighs a very light 1,170 grams. So no kind of real issues with GPU sag either. And thanks to that gorgeous design, mounting it horizontally or vertically will simply look amazing inside any system, including smaller form factor builds too, which can now be done. Now, one interesting thing is that even though it has such a low TGP, it still includes a single 12VH PWR connector, which I'm actually okay with, as it does allow for a cleaner installation inside your system. Now, the cooler is typical of what we've come to expect from NVIDIA. The cover comes off and is held in by screws that split the plastic shroud and the main large heatsink, and is still a thing of beauty with some of the best engineering I've seen on a graphics card. And along with the 4 screws holding the I/O bracket in place, is one of the easiest cards to take apart. The fans are connected by flat ribbon cables and everything just feels, I don't know, premium overall. The PCB is, what we've come to expect from a founder's card, and a simple 6-phase design for the GPU is in place, along with a further 2 phases for the GDDR6X memory. Nothing overkill, but somewhat sufficient for the power we're expecting to be delivered. Now, it doesn't stop there, as we also have another MSRP based card with the Twin X2 model from INNO3D. Design wise, it's simple, clean, and looks more kind of professional and less gamery. Likely a reason how they've managed to keep the price at MSRP, while other SKUs from them should have a bit more flair, but you'd be expected to pay for it. Again, size is kept to a minimum, coming in at 250mm long, 112mm high, and again, 40mm wide, meaning also it will only take up 2 slots inside your case. Weight-wise, it comes in at 966 grams, so 204 grams less than the founder's card. So again, you shouldn't have any issues with sagging or the need for additional mounts to help prop the card up. Now, the most interesting thing about the Inno card is the power connector, because seemingly NVIDIA's reference spec doesn't have a mandatory 12VH PWR connector, and instead, this card features a single 8-pin PCI Express connector. Something that will potentially make AMD think about their future stack and how NVIDIA are able to compete on the more mid-tier range of cards while featuring the same connector. Now, taking this card apart is also very simple, with 8 screws for the backplate, a further 4 holding down the GPU to the main heatsink, and 3 for the I/O bracket. Once removed, this time we see a reference looking PCB, but with 8 phases for the GPU and a further 2 for the memory. It wouldn't actually surprise me if custom AIB cards came with an even beefier setup that can utilise higher power limits, which is something we'll look at in future content as we get those types of cards in. Now, the backplate on this card also features some thermal pads to assist in cooling, though with a TGP of 200 watts, it's likely actually not really needed, but is still nice to see. So to look at, both cards seem to tick all of the right boxes, and on paper, the spec looks good, but how do they perform? Well, to test that, we threw the Founders card onto our GPU test system, consisting of an Intel Core i9-12900K on an Asus Maximus Z690 Hero motherboard with 32GB of Patriot Viper 6200MHz dual channel memory. All testing was performed on Windows 11, and along with various synthetic benchmarks, we also tested 15 games in total, and we'll be putting our focus on 1440p and 4K today. So let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So kicking things off with 3D Mark Time Spy Extreme, and it's here that we see the RTX 4070 sitting just behind the RX 6800 XT, a card that was more expensive at launch, though has been out for some time now. Compared to the RTX 3080, the 4070 does sit slightly behind, with the 30 series card sitting around 7% ahead overall, so not the best start for the 4070. Port Royal sees the 4070 pushing ahead of AMD's 6000 series stack, and still somewhat behind the 3080 10GB, which again still sits 7% ahead in the FPS and 6% ahead in the overall score. It's not a bad result, but I was just expecting a little more, especially considering the newer generation of RT cores on this card. Puget Bench for budding content creators again sees the 4070 sitting just behind the 3080, which comes in with a 5% better score overall, showing that the newer architecture and slightly increased memory doesn't really make any real difference in this test. So moving on to gaming and starting with a Plague Tale Requiem, where we see the 4070 performing just shy of the RTX 3080 by around 6%. Compared to the 6900 XT, the NVIDIA based card sits 1% higher in performance with a slightly stronger 1% low figure as well, so it's off to a fairly good start when it comes to gaming. At 4K, the performance is pretty well matched with the 6800 XT, but again falls behind the RTX 3080, this time by around 10%. For me, again I was just expecting a little more, though we are just only one game in at this point. Assassin's Creed Valhalla at 1440p came in with a respectable 129 FPS, putting it 19% faster than the RTX 3080 10GB and matched the performance in the averages and the 1% lows of the 6950 XT. Though the strong performance of the RTX 2080 wasn't too far behind, coming in just 3% slower overall. 4K still sees a healthy lead of 12% over the RTX 3080 and only 2 frames per second behind the RTX 4070 Ti, which, considering we're at 4K on ultra high settings, really does offer up some pretty great performance overall for a card that's retailing for $599. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at 1440p sees the RTX 4070 coming in the middle of our stack, still pumping out just under 5% more performance than the RTX 3080 10GB, and sitting just under 7% behind the RX 6800 XT, a card that launched for $50 more when it was first released. 4K sees the 4070 drop down the chart slightly as the 3080 comes in with 3% more performance in the averages and very similar 1% lows. The 4070 actually performs identically to the RX 6800, making it a viable proposition, but nothing groundbreaking overall. Control at 1440p leaves me somewhat repeating myself as the 4070 sits in the middle of our charts with identical performance to the RX 6800 XT, though AMD do come in with marginally better 1% low figures, though nothing to shout home about anyway. The RTX 3080 manages to storm ahead by 14% in this title, but one game really doesn't make all that much difference. 4K is a very similar story, trading blows with the RX 6800 XT, though it's still not enough to hit that magical 60 FPS figure, where we find the RTX 3080 pushing 19% more performance out in comparison to the newest Ada Lovelace based GPU. Cyberpunk at 1440p again sees some competitive performance when compared to the 6800 XT, which, while the AMD card sits 2% ahead of Team Green, the 1% low figures really suffered, showing that NVIDIA have the upper hand when it comes to a more fluid gameplay experience, though the RTX 3080 still pushes further ahead beyond that by 13% overall and with stronger 1% low figures as well. At 4K, again it's fighting tooth and nail with the 6800 XT, which sits 5% faster than the 4070, though the NVIDIA based card comes back with 7% better dips, so I guess you could chalk that one up as a bit of a draw. While the RTX 3080 still manages to push ahead, offering up 21% better performance overall. I guess NVIDIA's claims aren't exactly on the money so far. The performance in Death Stranding is a bit better at 1440p, with the RTX 4070 falling just 2% behind the RTX 3080. Though the 6800 XT that it had been battling it out with storms ahead now by 14% overall, and also putting it into perspective that the 4070 Ti isn't such a bad card overall based on this one game. Jumping up in resolution to 4K, and the 3080 manages to widen the gap, now sitting 9% faster than the 4070, which is also now 13% slower than the 6800 XT. Destroy All Humans sees some pretty respectable performance, though it's very clear to see how CPU limited we are here, with results sitting pretty much all over the place, which doesn't really tell us too much. The CPU bottleneck disappears at 4K and doesn't really do the RTX 4070 much favours here, as it now sits 6% slower than last generation's RTX 3070 Ti, and 10% slower than the RTX 3080 and 6800 XT. Doom Eternal sees some strong numbers at 1440p, almost matching that of the 6800 XT and RTX 3080, with just 1% between them, though the newer card did demonstrate better performance in the dips, though only by around 2% or so. 4K sees the 4070 pushing ahead of the 6800 XT by 3% and now sitting just 1% slower than the 6900 XT, which even after multiple retests gave us terrible 1% low figures. Still wasn't enough to match or beat the performance of the 3080 though, which now sits 5% faster than the 4070. The 4070 came in 8% slower than the RTX 3080 in Dying Light 2 at 1440p, showing its performance that sits faster than its predecessor, the RTX 3070, as expected, though still not enough to bolster up the claims by NVIDIA in regards to the 3080. At 4K, the RTX 3080 and 6800 XT swap places, though the 4070 still ends up sitting about 9% behind the AMD based card and 14% slower when compared to the 3080. F122 at 1440p again sees levels of CPU bottlenecking on certain cards, and due to this we see the 4070 and 3070 Ti performing very close to each other. While at 4K, things change up quite a bit, again seeing performance on the 4070 middle of the road, 4% behind the 6800 XT and 12% behind the RTX 3080 10GB. It's strong in terms of performance, but I was just expecting a little more. Far Cry 6 showed some slightly better performance for the RTX 4070, or you could argue slightly worse for the RTX 3080, which sees just 1 FPS between them and with identical 1% lows. 4K, however, sees the 3080 push another 4% more performance compared to the 4070, which, much like all of our charts so far, sits somewhat middle of the road. Horizon Zero Dawn is an odd title, especially at some resolutions, as the performance is so similar across all cards, really not giving us much to talk about, other than the fact that the RTX 4070 again turns up middle of all the cards tested, again around 4% behind the RTX 3080. It's a similar story at 4K in terms of the positioning for the 4070, though the 3080 now sits 14% ahead of the newest card from NVIDIA. Moving on to Spider-Man, and things are looking good for Team Green with solid performance on the RTX 4070 that positions it 8% faster than last generation's flagship from AMD, the 6950 XT, though it's still not enough to rival the RTX 3080 as it comes in 5% slower overall. The AMD flagship from last generation fights back at 4K with its own 8% better performance and a slightly healthier margin of 9% when compared to the RTX 3080, though the 4070 was still able to push ahead of other cards from AMD's 6000 series. Flight Sim is probably the most severely CPU bottleneck title that we test, and that's clear to see at 1440p with results showing no cohesion whatsoever and all within very slim margins of each other. 4K sees that bottleneck somewhat eliminated to a degree, but with such poor performance across the board, the only saving grace for any card really is an X3D based CPU or DLSS 3, which we'll be looking at shortly, so there could be something in it for the 4070 here. Lastly, in Watch Dogs Legion, we again see a close fight between the RTX 4070 and RTX 3080, separated by just 1 frame per second in the averages and also in the 1% lows, which still puts the 4070 towards the middle of our charts with some pretty strong performance, but again, nothing groundbreaking. Then at 4K, the 3080 is able to stretch its legs slightly, while the 4070 sits between both 6800 series cards, which doesn't set the world alight, considering a 6800 XT can be had for less money than an RTX 4070. So lots of data we've gone through, and for the most part, I'm left feeling a little bit hollow. For some titles, it traded blows with the RTX 3080 and higher end 6000 series from AMD, but that's about it. Because while it traded blows, in other titles they demolished it, in some cases by 14% or higher. It's moments like these where I refer to my statement about taking things with a pinch of salt, because it's not really lived up to the hype. I mean, it's not bad, but for a 40 series card, it doesn't seem to have that same level of excitement when it comes to performance that the rest of the stack actually did have. Maybe that's me expecting too much for what is, I guess, quintessentially a mid-tier card, because I've been spoiled with the likes of the 4080 and 4090, or maybe I'm onto something. The easiest way to see where things are positioned is to look at overall averages across all 15 titles that we tested, and at 1440p, things are actually better than what they first seemed. While the 3080 does come in 4% faster overall, the 1% low figures are a little closer. And as we know, the 4070 should come in, I guess, much more efficiently, which we will find out when we look at power delivery very shortly. 4K is similar, though the 3080 does move up our chart as expected, being an 80 spec card compared to a 70 spec card, which is arguably aimed more at 1440p gaming than anything higher. Though the 4070 did show that in certain titles, even with settings cranked up, it was more than powerful enough to compete, though at almost evenly matched performance to the 6800 XT, it feels as though we're missing some slight kind of evolution here. It's a much newer card and performance has hit, I don't know, a metaphorical wall of some kind. Luckily, we should see that spark of evolution and an uplift when it comes to ray tracing and DLSS performance. Starting with A Plague Tale Requiem, where we saw the RTX 3080 commanding an 11% lead over the RTX 4070 in rasterization performance, and enabling DLSS in performance mode did see these figures jump up, though the 3080 still had a healthy 9% lead over the Ada Lovelace-based GPU. Thankfully, DLSS 3 now pushed another 35% more performance out of the RTX 4070, now propelling it 24% ahead of the Turing-based RTX 3080. In Control, the RTX 4070 was already matching the performance of the 6800 XT, while with ray tracing enabled, the 4070 did come in 19% faster at 31 FPS average. While enabling DLSS saw another 96% more performance, leaving it now 12% behind the RTX 3080. Cyberpunk is where we can really appreciate the true potential of the 40 series thanks to DLSS 3, which pushes an extra 31% more performance compared to the RTX 3080 and 108% more compared to the 6800 XT, of which both cards don't have DLSS 3 with frame generation based technology, which is where I feel the RTX 4070 can really make up for its shortfalls. Spider-Man is very much the same story, with the RTX 3080 beating the rasterization performance of the 4070, while with ray tracing enabled we see identical performance and then some pretty typical gains on both cards, that now sees the newer card coming in stronger with a lead of just under 6%. Enabling DLSS 3 ekes out another 13% more performance, which matches the performance of the 4070 Ti with DLSS enabled without frame generation at 103 frames per second. Microsoft Flight Sim being such a heavily CPU bound title means that DLSS 3 is a real saving grace, and something that gives a huge lead of 57% over the RTX 3080, which even without DLSS 3 was performing nigh on identically to the RTX 4070 with the previous version of DLSS enabled. Then lastly, in Watch Dogs Legion, we start to see some strong performance uptakes on the RTX 4070 that almost makes up for the loss in performance that we saw from enabling ray tracing, bringing us numbers that sit just 7% behind compared with no ray tracing or DLSS being enabled. So DLSS 3 clearly makes a big difference to the RTX 4070, and to me at least it seems NVIDIA are hedging their bets on frame generation, giving them the upper hand. While some will comment that it's fake frames and smoke and mirrors, it's really not, and instead it's just the next step in AI computing. And the fact that games still look stunning, why wouldn't you want the very best performance tailored to you without spending a ton of money on a card and then not enabling it? Trying to get my mind into that of NVIDIA's, and I think I'm bang on the money. Speaking of money, it is worth looking at cost per frame, because that's actually the easiest way to decipher if something offers good value for money overall. And it's here where we've taken the MSRP price of the 4070 and compared it to the selling prices of the other cards involved. That there we actually find out at 1440p, the RTX 4070 actually offers pretty decent value for money in the grand scheme of things. The only cards that offer better value for money are some of the 6000 series from AMD and lower end and older NVIDIA based cards like the 3060 Ti and RTX 2080. In comparison, the RTX 3080, which was one of our key points for comparison, still offers frankly terrible value for money that comes in 42% more expensive per frame at this resolution. 4K is a very similar story, though the 7900 XT comes slightly back into the mix, even though I've argued that it doesn't offer great value for money. Though at 4K, it seemingly does compared to the 4070. Though to play devil's advocate, the 4070 isn't really aimed at 4K gaming anyway, and is more suited for 1440p. In the UK, where prices are somewhat different, the 4070 does still fall towards the end of our stack, only being bested by some 30 series cards, which also perform worse, and the RTX 2080. Again, with the 3080 still offering terrible value for money when comparing to the two. Then, if gaming at 4K, the 6800 from AMD is arguably the better card in terms of value, but only by a small margin, meaning that if you want the newest technology, the 4070 really is the best card, and that's including the early adopter tax that you'd get with a freshly new product. So obviously we have two cards here, so taking a look at how each of the 4070 cards we have compares, just to see how different the Founders and the Twin X2 card from INNO3D is, and as expected, there really isn't much in it. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the INNO3D card and Founders card performed within 1% of each other in the averages, with identical 1% low figures. Cyberpunk is very much the same story, with both cards outputting the same performance, with only a slight 1 frame per second difference in the 1% lows. There was a slightly bigger variance of 3% in favour of the FE card in Death Stranding in both the averages and the 1% lows, then just a single frame per second difference in Watch Dogs Legion between both of the cards. So the big question comes down to, if performance is so similar between two MSRP based cards, what makes one better than the other? And that all comes down to how the coolers do. So starting with the Founders card, during an hour-long loop of F122 at 4K on the high preset, and here we saw the GPU temperatures rising to a cool and comfortable 65 degrees, while the hotspot peaked at 79 degrees and the memory at 76 degrees, all at a modest 1566 RPM in terms of the fan speed. In terms of the power consumption, things were also kept under control, only seeing the total power rise into 190 watts during our 1 hour long run. The INNO3D card also kept things under control at the same 65 degrees for the GPU and 79 degrees on the hotspot. But the big difference here was the memory temperature, which came in 10 degrees lower than the NVIDIA Founders card at just 66 degrees. Maybe that backplate, among other things, is what helps aid the performance, as the fans also ran at a slightly lower 1541 RPM, all while consuming 193 watts at their highest point. So some pretty good performance for the RTX 4070, and some choices when it comes to what SKU of card to buy. And while the RTX 4070 does offer up the latest architecture, as I mentioned, I think NVIDIA are extremely reliant on DLSS 3 to use as a bit of a marketing tool to help propel its performance. Because during pure rasterization, it was good, but didn't exactly blow me away. That's not through any fault of NVIDIA. I'm just so used to high-end GPUs now that it's kind of hard to remember what mainstream cards are actually meant to be like. But in all honesty, it seems to be right on the mark. Sure, some will complain due to the price, but I think $599 is about right, considering the performance level that it's actually at. It's faster than the RTX 3070 Ti and is slower than an RTX 3080 in some games. And pricing wise, comes in the same as the 3070 Ti and $100 lower than the 3080 when that launched, though prices are still all over the place for it anyway. Like any new technology, you will be expected to pay the premium for it, but as time goes on, you could see things get a little more aggressive, especially considering AMD have nothing in the current stack in terms of the 7000 series that can compete at that level. But when they do, we could have kind of a real dogfight on our hands. And that's where I think it comes down to on GPUs now, pricing, because it's been such a volatile thing for so long. But for me, this is a start of things getting back to some normality. And in all honesty, it's about time. To wrap things up, NVIDIA have a fine product. It doesn't blow me away for the reasons I've stated, but for anyone rocking a 20 series or a 3070 or even a 3070 Ti, you're going to be in for a real treat. And with more games adopting DLSS 3 now than ever, it's only going to get better. And the RTX 4070 might just end up being NVIDIA's best GPU yet. For me, just needs a little more time to mature. So there you have it. Do you agree with my thoughts? Have NVIDIA done enough, or is there still work to be done? For me, we'll probably end up looking at frame generation in a lot more detail across the whole stack and at varying resolutions, because I feel that we've only just started to scratch the surface of what's possible. So yeah, apologies for the long video, but I hope you can appreciate there was a lot to go through. And remember, we will have another video tomorrow going through another 4070 that's just slightly higher priced to see what you get for that extra money. For now, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to our testing data, exclusive behind the scenes content, access to a super special area on Discord, and you even get to come to our offices for exclusive Patreon meetup weekends. And there's just much, much more on top of that. The link for all that is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.